So how do you think you account for like the intergenerational information loss that can happen sometimes? Is like talking about like when we study historical context and paradigms and things within the context of our own existence, how do we communicate that to future generations or future students or whatever? Because that seems to be a constant issue for me whenever I encounter stuff like this or read about things like this, that we reason our way to the same general points each time any topic like race or disparity and whatever are studied, and we kind of rehash the same like handful of issues. And we have been, like Joel and I were talking about the Tao Te Ching the other day, and one of the most striking things that I found when I read that for the first time was that they were talking about the exact same stuff that we all see in like self-help blogs and things now. So there's something that's stopping whatever enlightenment or knowledge or just understanding or compassion from trickling down through the ages. And I've always been kind of perplexed by that, because it seems like it goes hand in hand with studying and understanding our history in these ways. But there's some sort of thing that seems to get recycled each time. And I don't know if it's that every generation wants their shot at like having the same adventure that they were promised or that they were taught, or if we're all just fundamentally dumb and we keep falling for the same tricks. But it's something every time there's someone talks about like the benefits and the cons of studying history, this is the thing that always occurs to me, is like, well, who cares if we're studying history or we're studying the present or we're anticipating the future if we keep falling for the same stuff?
You know, I think part of the problem is that like history itself is kind of a battleground, that like we're fighting over the information that people are getting and how they're thinking about that information. And like our public school system is a perfect example of that, right? Like we have a certain curriculum that we're supposed to teach, and that gets shifted, but it's largely created by a state that has like certain goals in mind. And part of those goals are like, those goals are rarely liberatory. Those goals are usually more like, how do we teach nationalism, right? How do we teach students to appreciate the nation or the systems we've created? How do we teach students to exist within those systems? Like, and even if it's like, how do we teach them to do it responsibly in a way that's geared towards justice? It's usually not framed as how do we teach or study history or any subject with the goal of like creating a more liberatory society, one that's actually founded on like full egalitarianism, or like, dismantling the things that aren't working, right? It's usually about reform and not revolution. And so if you're only ever teaching in that framework, you're never giving people the actual tools that they need to create the kind of change that I think we're talking about, right? So usually people have to seek that out themselves, which it's happening only for those people who already are like clearly on a path that's committed to that kind of change, rather than for the average person who maybe hasn't come to that framework on their own.
That seems to be a really tricky thing. We've talked about this on, I don't remember what episode it was, but we were talking about education to some extent and sort of suggesting that like a lot of change isn't going to be fully possible until it's able to trickle all the way down from, whatever kind of university common room it was contrived in to like the coal mines of West, wherever. Like, it doesn't seem like a lot of things will be universally possible, like, which isn't to say that change can't happen or that progress can't happen or different conversations can't happen, because they absolutely are. And it's incredibly heartening to see. But it seems like the types of advancements that everybody's yearning for a little bit, those are the ones that need to be made more palatable across a lot of different sectors of society, and probably not even just Western society, but just crossing a lot of different cultural boundaries that it seems very difficult to cross. And that's where I feel like it connects back to the whole human condition idea for me. It's like, it seems like a lot of historical knowledge, it's like they're like little markers for like, this is how we were dealing with this issue then, and this is how we're dealing with this issue then. But they're the same like 6 or 7 issues. They're all the same, like, we're trying to establish and maintain hegemony. We're trying to reason with the afterlife. We're trying to justify getting out of bed and dealing with a cascade of bullshit every morning. Like, it's all kind of the same very human stuff. And I'd be really interested to see if that was ever possible to work into these discussions of history more in a more present sense. Because I love learning about this kind of stuff, but I find that I have to go elsewhere for that type of inquiry, you know, like for the real kind of Socratic edge to it that you don't typically get when it's laid out as facts. And I wish it were more possible to overlay those two things.
Yeah, and like Adam was saying, like who's laying it out as facts for you, you know?
Yeah.
And if you're being taught how to exist in a nationalist way, if you're being taught how to exist within hegemony, and you're being taught basically radical acceptance of stasis, so that you can serve what has come before you and what has been established for you to exist within.
Yeah.
Then you have to question who is teaching you to live that way and who is teaching you to serve those things. And is it serving them more than it's serving you? You know?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, obviously, like my frame is coming from like being in public education and seeing like we're moving away from teaching history as just a series of facts, which I think is like number one, like the most important thing we have to do, right? That it's not one narrative. In fact, there's multiple narratives, and that narrative looks completely different depending on like whose point of view you're looking from, right? Which is like one of the things that is being actually pushed in history classes, at least to some degree. And I think it differs depending on what district you're in and all that sort of stuff. Another thing that they're doing too is they're like, schools are as a whole pushing towards like certain reading skills that are actually like rooted in being able to understand complex text, right? So that students are making meaning of things themselves. And I think that like generally is really good. But there's like, and I was just talking with another teacher about this yesterday, and there's like there's still at least a piece that's missing. And it's that piece that like you're going further and collectively doing the work of like reimagining, right? Like I feel like that's always where we get stuck, and that's where we like find ourselves like repeating the same things over and over as we get to this place where we can maybe even up to the point where we can criticize certain systems, but not beyond to the fact that we're like imagining and then also learning the skills to like create, right? Something new. And I think that's where we're starting to see like ethnic studies programs, for instance, which Holyoke, Massachusetts has one. It's like one of the only places I know of on the East Coast where it's like district wide. And they're teaching students like they're teaching students the practice of praxis, which is like being able to identify problems, consider the root causes of those problems, develop and put into place actual solutions for those problems, and then like evaluate how successful they were, right? So that like,
yeah, I like that. That's cool.
So that they're like actually going through, like it's a completely different kind of learning, you know, social studies and learning history, because you're learning history as a tool, not just as a narrative, right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
And these are the things. This is where I feel like we're not properly, and I think this is maybe a funny word to use, but like weaponizing like social studies and history in a way that's aimed at like dismantling and destroying those systems that aren't working for us, or like those cycles that we're getting stuck in over and over and over again.